Under Constraint, Chastity and Modesty in Hume, by Ann Levey. In Book 3 of the treatise, Hume undertakes the task of demonstrating why the obligation of women to be chaste and modest is greater than the obligation of men. Women are required to be more chaste than men, and only women are required to be modest. Hume's task here could be described as demonstrating the emergence of a double standard of sexual conduct as a moral requirement. This section of the treatise is of special interest not only because it is Hume's only discussion in the treatise of a primarily female virtue, but also because it is his only example of how specific artificial virtues arise in a society. Virtues, furthermore, that he claims are still more conspicuous instances of the operation of those principles, which I have insisted on. The principles he has in mind are those that relate to moral approbation and disapprobation to the general interests of society. This passage is also of interest because it has generated debate among feminist readers of Hume. His supporters have argued that Hume's discussion of chastity and modesty shows his awareness of the sexism of his time, while his detractors have argued that his moral framework provides the grounds for a justification of sexist discrimination. While I do not make any claims about whether Hume's political theory is sexist, the presence of such a debate makes it especially appropriate to ask whether Hume's remarks on chastity and modesty are consistent with his general principles, a task I take to be a first step in deciding whether a Humean framework is morally troubling. I argue that Hume is quite correct in thinking that chastity and modesty provide conspicuous instances of his general principles. After first giving a brief outline of Hume's general theory of the artificial virtues, I shall show how chastity and modesty emerge as artificial virtues in Hume's system. In particular, I will be concerned to show that the emergence of chastity and modesty can be described in general Humean terms, and that they do indeed have the key features of an artificial virtue. My aim here is not to address those who think that chastity and modesty are natural virtues, but to address those who think that Hume is mistaken in thinking them to be virtues at all, as well as those who, like Annette Bayer, think Hume is wrong in his claim that these are typical artificial virtues. Section 1. Hume's General Theory. Moral judgments are for Hume certain sorts of impressions. The actions or character traits that count as moral are those that tend to produce a sentiment of moral approbation. Moral approbation, according to Hume, is caused by those character traits that promote behavior having a tendency toward the public good, and disapprobation is caused by those character traits that have the opposite tendency. Because Hume's account is a causal one, it is possible for character traits or actions which do not have a tendency towards the public good to produce moral approbation. As I read Hume, those character traits would nevertheless count as moral. The moral quality of an action or character resides in the sentiment of the judgers, rather than in the objective facts about the object judged. This is Hume's sentimentalism. The uniformity of moral judgments is accounted for by the uniformity of the human mind. We naturally tend to approve of the agreeable and useful. Hume distinguishes between the natural and artificial virtues. There are two main differences between them. First, natural virtues, or the actions that they produce, are those that give rise to moral approbation when considered individually, because those single acts are useful or agreeable, while actions arising from artificial virtues only produce moral approbation when considered in the context of a general practice of such actions, because a single act considered in isolation from the general practice of which it is a part need not be useful. Benevolence, for example, is a natural virtue, because even a single act of benevolence is useful to its recipient. Respect for private property is an artificial virtue. It may require, for example, that a poor woman return goods to a rich one, an act that is harmful to the poor woman and need not be beneficial to the rich woman. Such an act considered in itself will not give rise to sentiments of moral approbation. However, a general scheme of property rights is beneficial because it tends to reduce the insecurity about possessions and hence tends to reduce social discord. Thus, artificial virtues depend on the existence of a convention, whereas natural virtues are virtuous when considered individually. The second main distinction between the natural and the artificial virtues lies in the motive for acting virtuously. According to Hume, moral judgments are judgments of the motives from which actions are done. Some motives that elicit moral sentiments are natural motives. Benevolence or parental concern for one's offspring are natural motives which elicit moral approval. Such motives are motives that we naturally have, and they tend to produce actions that are useful or beneficial. In the case of artificial virtues, however, the motives that are the objects of moral approbation are not natural motives, but rather motives of duty or of regard for justice. These motives are not natural since their content depends on the existence of conventions. The origin of artificial virtues is self-interest, but this motive does not produce moral approbation. In the case of artificial virtues, the natural motive that gives rise to the convention is not the motive that elicits the moral approval. The latter is an artificial motive. Self-interest does not elicit moral approbation, although reflective self-interest will lead to the adoption of conventions. The immediate products of self-interest do not tend to be actions whose effects are useful or beneficial. Hence, an artificial motive is required, one that is learned within the context of particular conventions. Given Hume's account of the artificial virtues, to show that chastity and modesty are typical artificial virtues requires showing two things. One, that chastity and modesty must rely on the existence of a convention for their general usefulness, and two, that the motive which produces moral approbation is separate from the motive of self-interest that explains the convention. Section 2. Chastity and Modesty. Hume introduces a section on chastity and modesty in the treatise as a kind of test case for his general system. He has argued that an account based on general social interest is adequate to explain not only a large number of the traits that get counted as virtuous, but also our moral approbation of these traits. If he can show that something as central to feminine virtue as chastity and modesty can be accounted for by his general system, then it counts as a powerful confirmation of his theory. According to Hume, the need for a double standard of sexual conduct arises from a trivial and anatomical observation. Because the principle of generation goes from the man to the woman, a woman can be sure that the children she bears are her own, while her mate cannot be sure that they are his. Hume adds in his anatomical observation a psychological observation about child rearing. In order to induce the men to impose on themselves this restraint and undergo cheerfully all the fatigues and expenses to which it subjects them, they must believe that the children are their own, and that their natural instinct is not directed to a wrong object, when they give a loose to love and tenderness. These two claims, combined with Hume's belief that the long period of maturation in the human young requires that they have the care of both parents, lay the groundwork for a Humean justification of a double standard of sexual conduct. If children are to be raised by both parents, then it is necessary to have chastity in women in order to give men that assurance of paternity that they require, but it is not equally necessary to have chastity in men. Here, Hume is not obviously right. Suppose that we grant his claims that there is no natural motivation to care for children that are not one's own, and that children cannot be adequately cared for by a single adult. Since part of Hume's general position is that natural motivations can be redirected in accord with useful social conventions, his psychological observation cannot be an immediate obstacle to conventions other than the convention of female chastity and modesty. And while children may require the care of more than a single adult, it does not follow that they require the care of two natural parents. A convention requiring the care of children by maternal kin, for instance, solves the problem nicely and does not require a convention of female chastity. So it is worth noting right at the start that Hume begins by assuming something like a nuclear-style patriarchal family as the appropriate unit for raising children, since without such an assumption, the care of children by their fathers is not to the point. This is, however, a legitimate assumption for Hume to make. He need not show that chastity and modesty will be virtues under any conceivable circumstances, but only that they are obvious conventions in the context of certain patterns of child rearing. Any story we tell about how chastity and modesty arise as artificial virtues will have to appeal to the presence of other conventions within which chastity and modesty make sense. Chastity and modesty are virtues for women when they are because they are necessary for the maintenance of a society organized around a certain kind of family structure, and we would expect them, on a Humean account, to arise in tandem with those social structures. The plasticity of Humean framework leaves open the possibility of alternative family structures. Hume discusses some of these alternatives in his essay of Polygamy and Divorces, where he discusses at least one arrangement that would not provide for paternal care of children. But given that his aim in the treatise is to show that his theory can account for chastity and modesty's being virtues, he can take the social structures in which they arise as given. Chastity is generally defined as refraining from unlawful sexual activity. Hence, what is required by the virtue of chastity depends on what constitutes the boundaries of lawful sexual activity. Hume uses the term chastity in two different ways. He sometimes uses chastity to mean conjugal fidelity, and elsewhere uses chastity to mean abstention from all sexual activity outside of marriage. Conjugal fidelity obligates both men and women alike, and this for both natural and artificial reasons. Fidelity occurs in a list of natural virtues of benevolence, and since marriage is, according to Hume, a blend of lust and affection, we must expect that the latter tie will include fidelity, both sexual and otherwise. Where marriage contracts include vows of sexual fidelity, as they do in the context of Hume's discussion, each partner in a marriage is equally obligated to conjugal fidelity on the basis of these vows. As Hume's aim in the treatise is to explain the broader notion of chastity, however, his account cannot simply be a reduction to the artificial virtue of promise-keeping. The requirement to be chaste and modest obligates all women alike, regardless of what promises they may happen to have made. And the obligation of women to conjugal fidelity is stronger than the obligation of men. Hume notes at the end of the section on chastity and modesty that the obligations of the male sex to be chaste bear nearly the same proportion to the obligations of women as the obligations of the laws of nations do to those of the law of nature. Hume refers here to the previous section of the treatise in which he argues that the obligations of princes have the same extent, but not the same force, as the obligations of private citizens. Society is more willing to overlook transgressions in the cases of princes, because the fulfillment of their obligations is not as necessary to the maintenance of society. The explanation is similar for chastity and modesty. Chastity in women is more necessary than chastity in men for the maintenance of society. Thus, while there is no difference in the scope of the obligation, we think women more immoral than we think men are for their transgressions of these rules of sexual conduct. In the case of chastity, the greater obligation does lead in turn to a greater scope of obligations. The companion virtue of modesty, which arises as part of a mechanism to enforce female chastity, is strictly a female virtue. Hume's argument depends on the claim that conjugal infidelity in men may have a tendency to hurt particular persons, such as their wives and mistresses, but conjugal infidelity in women, or as we shall see, even the mere possibility of it, will tend to hurt society as a whole because men will be less inclined to look after children. Given Hume's trivial and anatomical observation, if children are to be raised by their fathers, then there had best be some means of identifying those fathers. The convention of having children reared by natural parents will work only in the presence of having some way of making the identification. Without some method of identifying fathers, the abandonment of children by males will lead to a disruption of normal social institutions, including presumably some things as the education of children into appropriate roles and the inheritance of property. The convention of female chastity functions as a way of ensuring that fathers can be reliably identified, and hence as a way of regulating the care of children. The reasons underlying chastity thus are not to do with the control of woman. Typically, conventions are maintained by a combination of legal sanction and inculcation of the appropriate virtuous motives, both of which serve to give more immediate reasons for conforming to a convention than do considerations of its long-term advantages. Though reflection tells us that artificial virtues are grounded in our self-interest, as Hume notes, all creatures, especially those of the female sex, are apt to overlook remote motives in favor of present temptation. Hence, we need the more immediate reasons that are provided by the threat of legal sanction and by instilling in people a regard for virtue. Conjugal fidelity, however, poses a problem because it cannot be readily enforced by legal means. The private nature of sexual transgressions makes it difficult to acquire the appropriate legal proof. If conjugal fidelity is to have any force as a virtue in women, there must be means of enforcing it. Hume suggests that society must fall back on the threat of a bad reputation, a punishment which can be imposed on the basis of the merest conjecture.